There are nights that arrive like a wound, quiet, sudden, irreversible. A knock at 3 minutes past midnight, a hand against a cold cheek. Hatred is a house with thick walls, a choice made before the mind catches up. We begin here. The knock came at 3 minutes past midnight, and it was not a knock at all, but the kind of sound a body makes when it has nothing left to give. A slumped, grey-slid weight falling against old wood. Hermione heard it from the kitchen, where she had been sitting alone with a cooling cup of tea and a book she had not turned a page of in nearly an hour. She froze. The house creaked around her in that particular way grim old place had. Ancient timber settling, portraits muttering in their sleep, the muffled hiss of gas lamps in the hall. And for a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, softer, more final. She was on her feet before she had decided to stand, wand already in her hand, the hem of her dressing gown catching against the chair as she moved into the corridor. The runner beneath her bare feet was cold. The air smelled of damp stone and the bitter herbs Molly had hung to dry above the stove. From upstairs came the heavy, distant rumble of Sirius's snoring, and from the parlour the slow tick of the long case clock that had been counting down something terrible for weeks now without ever telling anyone what. She reached the foyer and stopped. The troll leg umbrella stand cast a hunched shadow against the wall. The chain on the front door hung still. "Lumos," she whispered. Light bloomed at her wand tip, pale and trembling, and threw a thin circle against the door. She lifted her free hand and unfastened the bolt. Slowly, the metal scraping against itself with a sound like a held breath, and pulled it open by an inch. Severus Snape was standing on the front step. He was holding someone. For a long, suspended second, Hermione's mind refused to assemble the picture. Snape, here, on the doorstep of the Order's headquarters, in a travelling cloak black with rain and something darker, and in his arms, half slumped against his shoulder like a coat thrown over the back of a chair, a tall, narrow-shouldered figure with pale hair plastered to a paler forehead. She knew the hair before she knew the face. She had known that hair since she was 12 years old. "Move," Snape said. His voice was low and flat, and utterly without inflection, but there was a tremor underneath it, not in the words themselves, but in the breath that carried them. He stepped past her without waiting for permission, and the smell that came with him was extraordinary and terrible. Rain, yes, and ozone, the sharp char of recent magic, but beneath it something acrid and chemical that Hermione's mind, working faster than her body, recognized with a small lurch as fear sweat. Snape's fear. Snape, who had never been afraid of anything she had ever seen. "Professor," she began, "get Dumbledore, get Black, get whoever is awake and ambulatory, and bring them down here now, Miss Granger, before I drop him." He carried his burden past her into the hall and laid him, on the long settle beneath the troll leg stand. The boy's head lolled. His left arm fell loose and hung over the edge of the bench, and the sleeve had been pushed up to the elbow, and Hermione saw, in the wavering light of her wand, the dark mark on his forearm. It was new. The skin around it was still pink and inflamed. It had been burned into him not long ago at all. She made a sound she did not mean to make. "Granger." Snape's voice cracked at her like a thrown stone. Now! She moved. She did not remember the stairs. She remembered hammering on Sirius's door with the flat of her hand, and the cracked, hoarse shape of her own voice, saying, "Snape's here. Snape's here. He's brought someone." And Sirius going from sleeping to upright in the span of a heartbeat, his wand already drawn, his face a colourless mask. She remembered Remus appearing in the corridor in his shirt sleeves, with the soft, ruined expression of a man who had been awake all along. She remembered Harry. Harry, who was supposed to be asleep, who was never asleep when he should have been, coming out of his room with his hair standing up in every direction and his green eyes narrowing the moment he registered the urgency in her face. "What?" Harry said. "What is it?" "Don't—" Hermione started, and then could not finish, because she did not know what to ask him not to do. They came down the stairs together in a knot, Sirius first, Remus behind him, Harry last, and grim-mouthed. Ron's door opened as they passed. She heard him swear quietly and the soft thump of his feet on the floorboards. Mrs. Weasley's voice rose from somewhere distant, sharp with sleep, demanding to know what was going on. They reached the foyer. Sirius stopped so abruptly that Remus nearly walked into the back of him. For perhaps 3 full seconds, no one in the hall spoke. The only sound was the rain against the door, which had not been properly closed, and the rasping, shallow draw of breath from the figure on the settle. Then Sirius said, in a voice that had gone very, very quiet, "Severus, tell me why there is a Malfoy in my house." Snape did not turn. He was standing over the boy with his back to them, his shoulders set, one hand still resting at the base of Draco's throat, as though counting a pulse. "Because if I had left him at the manor, he would be dead before sunrise." "Severus, or worse." Snape's voice did not rise. It went, if anything, lower. "He would be alive." Remus stepped forward, slowly, the way one approached a wounded animal. "Severus, what has happened?" Snape's hand was still at the boy's throat. His knuckles, Hermione saw, were white. "The Dark Lord," he said, "has decided that Lucius's failure at the ministry must be paid for. He has selected Draco as the instrument of that payment. He has ordered him to kill Albus Dumbledore by the end of the school year. He has made Narcissa believe that this is an honor. He has made Draco believe that to refuse is to watch his mother die." A pause. "He has marked him, as you can see." Harry made a small, sharp sound. Not quite a laugh. Not quite anything. "And you brought him here," Sirius said. "I brought him to the only place in Britain where he might survive the week. He's a Death Eater." "He is 16 years old," Snape said, "and he has been a Death Eater for 11 days. And if you imagine that the boy lying on that bench is anything other than a child who has been broken open for someone else's revenge, then you are a greater fool than I have ever taken you for, Black, and I have taken you for considerable fool." Sirius opened his mouth, closed it. Hermione, who had been standing against the wall with one hand pressed to her own collarbone, as though to hold her heart inside her ribs, found that she had begun to move without permission. She crossed the foyer to the settle. She knelt. The boy on the bench was very pale and very still. His lips had gone a faint, wrong colour. His lashes lay dark against his cheek. She had not, she realised with a kind of dazed irrelevance, ever been close enough to him to notice that his lashes were dark. His hair, in every memory she had of him, was a uniform, polished white gold. Up close, wet with rain, it was the colour of old parchment, and there was a thin cut at his temple where something, a branch, a curse, a fist, had opened the skin. "Hermione," Harry said behind her. "Hermione, don't—" She had laid the back of her hand against Draco Malfoy's cheek. His skin was cold, not the cold of someone who had been out in the rain, the cold of someone whose body was deciding, slowly and methodically, that it had had enough. "He's freezing," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her. "He needs blankets. He needs— Sirius, we need to get him upstairs. He needs warmth and he needs— Professor, has he been hexed? Has he—" "Shock," Snape said. "Magical exhaustion. 2 minor curses I have already neutralized. The cold is the worst of it. I apparated 3 times in succession, and he was not prepared." "Hermione, get away from him!" That was Harry. His voice had gone tight and bright with something that was not quite rage and not quite grief. She did not turn around. She kept her palm where it was, against the cold cheek of a boy she had been taught for 5 years to despise, and she felt, beneath her fingers, faint as a moth's wing, the flutter of a pulse trying very hard to keep going. "Harry," she said quietly, "he's a person, whatever else he is. He's a person, and he is dying on Sirius's furniture, and we are going to help him, and we are going to argue about it afterwards." There was a long silence. Then Remus gently, "She's right. Sirius, help me get him to the back bedroom." Sirius did not move for another beat. His grey eyes were fixed on the figure on the settle, and Hermione could see, in the rigid line of his jaw, every black ancestor he had spent his life trying not to be. Then, abruptly, he exhaled through his nose, and the rigidity broke. "The blue room," he said. "2nd floor. There's a lock on the outside." "Sirius," Remus murmured. "There is a lock on the outside, Remus, and we are going to use it. And if any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me in the morning when I have had something stronger than tea." Remus said nothing. He bent and slid his arms beneath the boy's shoulders, and Snape of all people, with a tenderness Hermione would not have believed him capable of, took the legs, and between them they lifted Draco Malfoy from the bench as though he weighed nothing at all. He did, she thought. He weighed almost nothing. There was a hollow in his cheek that she did not remember from the train platform in June. She rose to follow them. Harry caught her elbow. "Hermione!" His voice was low, furious, almost pleading. "Do you know what he's done?" "I know what he was going to do, Harry. I heard the professor as well as you did." "That's not—" "And I know," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "That he is 16, and that his hands were shaking. Did you see that? When the professor said 'Mother,' his hands were shaking, Harry, and he didn't even know he was doing it." Harry stared at her. She gently lifted his fingers from her elbow. "Go back to bed," she said. "Please. There's nothing for you here tonight that won't still be here in the morning." She did not wait for him to answer. She turned and followed the lamplight up the stairs. The blue room was at the end of the 2nd floor corridor, narrow and damp-smelling, and dominated by a heavy 4-poster bed that had once belonged, Sirius said, to a great aunt none of them had ever met. They put him in it. Remus drew the covers up, Snape stood at the foot of the bed with one hand braced against the bedpost, and Hermione saw for the first time that his own hand was shaking too, a fine, almost invisible tremor that he was holding still by force of will. He had carried this boy out of Malfoy Manor. He had apparated 3 times to get him here. He had stood on the doorstep in the rain holding 16 years of someone else's mistake against his shoulder, and he had not, in any of it, allowed himself the luxury of trembling. He was permitting himself now the smallest piece of it. Hermione, without thinking, reached out and laid her hand on his sleeve. He did not look at her. He did not pull away. After a long moment, he said, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, "Watch him, Miss Granger. He will not know where he is when he wakes. He will be frightened. He will not show it. You must understand the difference." She nodded, though he was not looking at her to see it. He withdrew his arm from beneath her fingers very gently and walked out of the room without another word. Sirius locked the door from the outside. Hermione stood in the corridor a long time after they had gone, her palms still tingling faintly where she had touched Snape's sleeve, and, before that, Draco Malfoy's cheek. The house was settling back into its uneasy quiet. Somewhere below, she could hear Harry's voice and Mrs. Weasley's, low and urgent, the words indistinguishable. Somewhere above, the long case clock continued its patient counting. She did not go back to her room. She slid down the wall opposite the locked door, drew her knees up to her chest, and sat there in the cold corridor with her wand cupped in her palm and its small dim light pooled in her lap, listening for any sound at all from the other side of the wood. She listened until the first grey edge of morning began to leak under the front door downstairs. She did not hear him cry. She did not hear him wake. But once, near dawn, she heard him say a single word, muffled, broken, and so soft she nearly mistook it for the rain. And the word was mother. And Hermione Granger closed her eyes against the cold plaster of the wall and understood, with the terrible clarity of someone who had just lost an argument she had not known she was having, that nothing in her life was going to be quite the same again. He did not wake until the afternoon of the following day. Hermione knew, because she was the one watching when he did. She had not meant to be. The order, after a long and acrimonious meeting in the kitchen that lasted until well past breakfast, had settled on a rotating watch. 2-hour shifts, one drawn, door locked from the outside. Sirius had wanted auras. Moody had vetoed it. Snape had refused to leave the house until certain assurances were given, and the assurances, when given, had been thin and reluctant, and accompanied by a great deal of muttering from the portrait of Walburga Black in the hall. Hermione had volunteered for the early afternoon shift. Molly had looked at her with a worried softness and said, "Are you sure, dear?" And Hermione had said yes without entirely understanding why. She sat now in the wooden chair Remus had carried up from the dining room, positioned at an angle to the bed, her wand resting across her knee, and a book open in her lap that she was not reading. The blue room was full of the particular grey light that came through Grimmauld Place's windows in autumn. Thick, slow light, the kind that made everything in it look slightly underwater. Dust motes turned in the air above the bed. The single high window was streaked with old rain. He had not moved in 2 hours. Madame Pomfrey had been brought in at dawn under heavy secrecy and had pronounced him alive, exhausted, and not, in her precise phrasing, in any immediate danger of becoming otherwise. She had left 2 phials on the bedside table and instructions for when each was to be administered, and she had looked at Hermione on her way out with an expression that Hermione had not entirely understood until now. "Watch him," the look had said, not for what he might do, for what he might need. The first sign was his hand. It twitched against the coverlet, a small, involuntary curl of the fingers, as though he were reaching for something in a dream. Hermione's eyes went to it before she registered the rest of him. The hand was thin. The knuckles were raw, as though they had been struck against stone. There was an angry red scrape across the back of it she had not noticed last night. Then his breath changed. It deepened, then caught, then deepened again, and she saw the lashes flutter against the pale cheek, and she had perhaps 3 seconds to compose her face before his eyes opened. They were grey. She had always known that, in an abstract way. Malfoy has grey eyes, the kind of fact one absorbed without ever really looking. She had not known that they were the particular grey of pewter held under water. She had not known that the irises had a darker ring around them, almost charcoal, that gave the whole eye a curious depth. For a long moment, he did not move at all. He simply looked at the ceiling. His mouth was slightly parted. His chest rose and fell with the careful, measured rhythm of someone who was trying not to give themselves away. Then he turned his head. He saw her. She watched his face make the journey. Blank confusion first, the slack vacancy of someone who could not place where he was. Then a flicker of recognition. "Granger," his eyes said, and the slight contraction of his brow said, "What is Granger doing here?" And then, all at once, the memory. She saw it arrive. She saw it strike him. His whole body went rigid. The hand that had twitched a moment ago locked into a fist around a handful of coverlet. His other hand, the marked one, flinched toward his sleeve as though to cover something, and then froze halfway because the sleeve was already pushed up, because someone, Madame Pomfrey, this morning very gently, had cleaned the burned skin around the mark and rebandaged it, and there was nothing left to hide. He stared at the bandage on his own forearm as though he had never seen it before. "Don't," Hermione said quietly. His eyes snapped to her. "Don't try to sit up," she said. "You'll be dizzy. Madame Pomfrey said you mustn't, not yet." He did not answer. He was looking at her with an intensity that had nothing in it of the boy who had called her a mudblood on the platform of Hogwarts Express. There was no sneer. There was no contempt. There was only a wide, fixed animal alertness, the look of someone who had woken in a strange room and did not yet know whether the figure in the chair was friend or executioner. She set the book down very slowly on the floor beside her. She kept both hands visible. "You're at Grimmauld Place," she said. "Number 12. It's the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix. Professor Snape brought you here last night. You've been asleep for about 15 hours. His throat worked. His voice cracked on the first syllable. He swallowed and tried again. "My mother." "I don't know," Hermione said honestly. "Professor Snape left at dawn. He said he'd send word if he could." Something crossed his face that she could not name. It was not relief. It was not despair. It was the expression of someone whose entire structure of expectation had been suspended in mid-air and who could not, yet, look down to see what was beneath it. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the alertness had not gone, but it had been overlaid with something more familiar, a tight, cold control that she remembered from 5 years of corridors and classrooms. He pushed himself up against the pillows. He did it carefully. His arms were trembling. "Get out," he said. It was not loud. It was almost conversational. But the voice was the voice she remembered, clipped, precise, polished to a high shine. And for a moment, she felt a small, irrational sting of something that was almost relief. There he is. That at least is the same. "No," she said. His head turned sharply. "I'm sorry." "I'm on watch," Hermione said. "I'm not allowed to leave." He stared at her. "Watch. There's a rotating shift, 2 hours each. Mine ends at 4. She kept her voice even. "I'm not going to bother you. You can sleep. You can ignore me. But I'm not going anywhere until Tonks comes up to take over." "You're guarding me." "Yes." He let out a short, bitter sound that was nearly a laugh and not quite anything. "Granger," he said, "guarding me. The world has gone properly mad." "Yes," she said. "It rather has." He looked away. His jaw was very tight. She watched him work through it, whatever it was, in silence. The grey light from the window slid slowly across the coverlet. Somewhere downstairs, a door closed. Somewhere outside, a tram bell rang faintly. Several streets away, a small thread of Muggle London leaking through the wards. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, stripped. "What did he tell you?" "Professor Snape." "Yes." "He told us what your task was," she said carefully. "He told us about your mother. He told us he had decided that the vow would not, that he could not keep his promise to her any other way." "What promise?" She hesitated. "To protect you." The fist on the coverlet tightened. The knuckles went white. He was not looking at her. He was looking at a point in the middle distance, somewhere above the foot of the bed, and his face had gone perfectly, terribly still. "He should have left me there," he said. "No. Granger." His voice was suddenly very tired. "You don't know what you're—" "I do," she said. "Or, no, I don't. Not all of it. But I know that he didn't think you would survive what they were asking you to do. And I know that he was right. And I know that whatever happens next, you are not going to die in a manor drawing room for someone else's grudge. And that is not nothing. That is not nothing, Malfoy." He turned his head and looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the second time in 5 years. The grey eyes had gone very dark. "Why are you talking to me like that?" he said quietly. "Like what? Like I'm a person?" The question landed in the room with a small flat sound, like a stone dropped onto stone. Hermione discovered that she did not have an answer ready. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She felt, absurdly, the prickle of heat behind her eyes. "Because you are one," she said at last. "Whatever else is also true." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he turned his face to the wall, and he did not speak again for the rest of her shift. She did not see him again for 2 days. Moody came on the second day. She heard him through the kitchen ceiling, the heavy clump of the wooden leg on the floorboards above, the rumble of his voice, and once, very briefly, a thin, sharp sound from Draco that might have been a gasp and might have been a word bitten off in half. "Veritaserum," Sirius said grimly over breakfast, 3 drops, standard protocol. He's 16, Hermione said. He's a Death Eater in our house, Hermione, Sirius said, not unkindly. Moody has to be sure. Sure of what? Sure that Snape didn't make a mistake. She set her teacup down very carefully on its saucer. The saucer rattled. She did not pick it up again. That afternoon, Moody called her into the drawing room. He was sitting in the high-backed chair by the cold fireplace, his magical eye whirring in its socket. A roll of parchment lay across his knee. He did not invite her to sit. He looked her up and down with the ordinary eye, slowly, and then he said, without preamble, "I want you in the transcription chair tomorrow, Granger." "Sir?" "The Malfoy boy. Second session. I need a witness who writes fast and doesn't faint." A pause. The magical eye swiveled toward her and held. "And one he might actually talk to." "He won't talk to me." "He'll talk to you more than he'll talk to me, Granger, which is the bar we are working with at present. 8 a.m. Bring quills." "And—" He paused again, and something in his battered face softened by perhaps 1/4 of a degree. "And don't look at him while he's under. Some of them don't forgive it later, when they remember." She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the room she shared with Ginny, listening to Ginny's even breathing on the other side of the dark. And she thought about a hand twitching on a coverlet, and the dark ring around grey irises, and the way a 16-year-old boy had said "my mother" with the broken inflection of a child waking from a nightmare. She thought also about Harry, about the way he had not spoken to her at dinner, about the way his green eyes had gone flat and far away when she had walked past his chair, as though she had become, in some small and dreadful way, a stranger to him. She had chosen something in the foyer 2 nights ago, when she had laid her hand against Draco Malfoy's cheek. She had not yet understood what. She would understand it, she thought, beginning to drift at last toward an uneasy sleep. Very soon now. Tomorrow, perhaps? Tomorrow morning, in a locked drawing room, with a quill in her hand, and 3 drops of Veritaserum already loosening the tongue of a boy who had spent his whole life learning not to tell the truth. She would begin to understand exactly what she had chosen, and what it was going to cost her, and whether she had the courage. She, Hermione Granger, who had faced trolls and basilisks and the Department of Mysteries, and never once, in any of it, been frightened in quite this particular way. Whether she had the courage to keep choosing it every day in every room, against every voice in the house that was going to tell her she was wrong. She turned her face into the pillow. Outside the window, the rain had started again, very soft, very steady, drumming its slow, patient rhythm against the glass of Grimmauld Place, as though it intended to keep falling for the rest of the war. The drawing room at 8 in the morning smelled of cold ash and the bitter green tincture Moody used to disinfect his glass eye. Hermione arrived first. She had not been able to eat breakfast. She had carried her quills and a fresh roll of parchment down the stairs with the careful, deliberate concentration of someone moving through deep water. And she had set them out on the small table beside the fireplace, exactly as Moody had instructed. Ink to the right, blotting cloth to the left, 3 sharpened quills laid in a precise fan. Her hands were steady. She was rather proud of that. She had been awake since 4. The chair Moody had brought down for the questioning sat in the centre of the rug, a high-backed, ugly thing with carved arms and a faded red seat. There were no restraints on it. Moody had said, when she had asked, that restraints made them clench against you. Easier, he had said, if they didn't know they couldn't move. She did not then fully understand what he meant. The door opened at 8:01. Remus came in first, then Moody, his wooden legs striking the parquet with its familiar uneven rhythm. Between them walked Draco Malfoy. He was not bound. He was not visibly coerced. Remus had a hand at his elbow, light, almost solicitous, the way one might steady an elderly relative on stairs. And Draco was walking under his own power. But Hermione saw at once that he was walking the way a person walks towards something they have already decided to endure rather than to fight. His shoulders were set. His chin was up. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above the mantelpiece. He was wearing a grey jumper that did not belong to him. The sleeves were slightly too long. The cuff of the left sleeve, she noticed, had been pulled down over the bandage on his forearm with a deliberateness that hurt to look at. He did not look at her as he was led to the chair. He sat. He placed his hands on the carved arms. He kept his eyes on the mantelpiece. "Granger's transcribing," Moody said, by way of explanation that was not addressed to anyone in particular. "She writes faster than the rest of us put together. Don't mind her." A muscle moved in Draco's jaw. He did not say anything. Moody crossed to the small table beside Hermione, uncorked the phial of Veritaserum with his teeth, and counted out the drops onto a silver spoon. 3 drops, exactly. The liquid was clear and faintly luminous, like water with light caught in it. "Open." Draco opened his mouth. Hermione looked down at her parchment. She heard the small clink of the spoon. She heard the soft swallow. She heard Moody set the spoon back on its tray and the faint scrape of a chair being drawn up opposite the boy in the high-backed seat. "State your full name." A pause. Then, evenly, "Draco Lucius Malfoy." "State your date of birth." "The 5th of June, 1980. "State your blood status." A flicker of something. Not a hesitation exactly, but a small tightening of the mouth, as though the word were a stone he had to swallow whole. "Pure." Hermione's quill moved across the parchment in a quick, neat hand. She did not look up. "Don't look at him while he's under," Moody had said. "Some of them don't forgive it later." She kept her eyes on the ink. "On the night of August the 14th, Moody said, "you took the dark mark. Describe the ceremony." What followed was bad. She would not have used that word afterwards if anyone had asked her to describe it. She would have said clinical and difficult and necessary, because those were the words the order used. But she sat at the small table for 2 hours and 17 minutes, with her quill scratching across parchment in an unbroken line, and what she wrote down was bad. He answered everything. He answered in the flat, slightly slowed cadence of a person whose tongue has been loosened against his will. And he answered in complete sentences, because Lucius Malfoy had drilled his son in complete sentences from the time the boy could speak. And even with 3 drops of Veritaserum thinning his blood, Draco Malfoy did not know how to be inarticulate. He described the ceremony. He described the room. He described the smell of it. Like burning hair, he said, and Hermione's quill faltered for the first time on the page. And he described the moment Bellatrix had taken his wrist and pressed it down onto the marble table, and he described the moment his aunt had laughed. He described his mother's face in the doorway. "What did your mother do?" Moody said. She did not move. Why? Because she had been told that if she moved, the Dark Lord would understand that she had not consented to her son's elevation. Did she consent? A long pause. Hermione's quill hovered. "My mother," Draco said in the same even, slowed voice, "has not consented to anything that has happened in our house in 3 years." The quill scratched. The fire was unlit. The window beyond Moody's shoulder had gone a thin, pale autumn grey, and the light it threw against the side of Draco's face turned his hair the colour of bone. Moody moved on. He asked about the task. He asked about the cabinet. He asked about Rosmerta. He asked about Katie Bell. Hermione's quill almost broke its tip at the name, and Draco answered in that flat, suspended voice that he had not known what Rosmerta would do with the necklace, that he had only been told to find a way, that he had thought at the time that any way would do. "And the girl," Moody said. "I did not know her." "That is not what I asked." A long silence. The Veritaserum, Hermione knew from her reading, did not permit silence indefinitely. It dragged the answer out the way a tide dragged a stone. "I did not think about her," Draco said. "I thought about my mother. I thought about my mother, and I did not think about the girl. And when I heard afterward what had happened to her, He stopped. The Veritaserum did not permit him to stop. His mouth opened again against his own will, and the words came out with a thin, terrible reluctance. "I was sick in the bathroom on the 4th floor for the better part of an hour, and I did not tell anyone, and I never spoke of her again, and I did not stop. I did not stop." Hermione's quill had stopped moving. She was staring at the parchment. The last word she had written, "Stop," sat there in her neat, round hand at the bottom of the page, and her vision had gone very strange around the edges, as though she were looking down a long tunnel at it. "Granger," Moody said. She did not move. "Granger." She picked up the quill. She dipped it. She wrote the next line. Her hand was steady. She was rather proud of that, still. Moody asked 9 more questions. Draco answered them all. When the last question had been asked and the last answer given, Moody recorked the empty file, pushed himself up from his chair with a grunt and said, "Lupin, take him back upstairs. He'll be unsteady for an hour." Remus moved. He laid a hand under Draco's elbow with the same careful, neutral courtesy he had shown coming in. Draco did not look at him. Draco did not look at anyone. He stood, swayed once, and let himself be led from the room. He passed within 3 feet of Hermione's chair. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. The door closed behind them, and Moody let out a long, slow breath, and the room was very quiet for a long time. "Well," he said at last, "he's not lying." "No," Hermione said. Her voice came out level. "He's not." "You all right, Granger?" "Yes." He looked at her with the magical eye for a long moment, then with the ordinary one, which was kinder. "Go and get some air," he said gruffly. "Take an hour. The transcript will keep." She got up. She walked out of the drawing room. She walked down the hall and out the front door, which was not strictly permitted, but no one stopped her. and she stood on the top step of grim old place in the cold, thin sunlight and breathed very slowly in and out until the strange tunnel vision had receded and the sound of her own pulse had stopped roaring in her ears. Then she went back inside. She went up the stairs, past her own room, past Ginny's, past the second-floor landing, where Mrs. Black's portrait was sleeping with its mouth slightly open, to the blue room at the end of the corridor. She knocked. There was no answer. "It's Granger," she said into the wood. After a long moment, "Go away." His voice was rough. Veritaserum left the throat raw. She did not go away. She stood for perhaps a full minute with her forehead against the door. Then she went down to the kitchen and she took a clean glass from the dresser and she filled it with cold water from the tap and she carried it back up the stairs. The door was locked from the outside. She had the key. She had been given it that morning. She had not been told what she was meant to do with it beyond the strict mechanics of the shift rotation. But she turned it now, and she pushed the door open, and she stepped inside. He was sitting on the edge of the bed. His elbows were on his knees. His head was in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. Not crying, she saw at once, but the fine, deep tremor of a body trying to discharge what it had been asked to hold. He did not look up when she came in. "Granger," he said into his hands, "get out." She did not get out. She crossed the room. She set the glass of water on the bedside table, very quietly, so it would not startle him. She stepped back. "It will help," she said. "The shaking. Drink it slowly." He did not move. She turned to go. At the threshold, she paused with one hand on the doorframe, and she did not look at him, because she had understood now what Moody had meant about not looking at them after, and she said, keeping her eyes on the corridor beyond the door, "You stopped, Malfoy. In the end, you stopped." A long silence behind her. She did not turn around. "You were ordered to kill the headmaster," she said, "and instead, you are sitting in a locked room in the house of people who hate you, drinking water out of a glass I brought up from a kitchen you do not even know the way to, because Professor Snape decided you were worth saving, and you let him save you. That is a stop. Whatever else you did, that is a stop." She did not wait for him to answer. She stepped through the door and she pulled it closed behind her, and she turned the key in the lock with hands that were, finally, beginning to tremble. And she stood in the corridor with her palm flat against the wood for a long moment, listening, before she made herself walk away. She did not hear him drink the water. But when Tonks went up at 4 to take the next shift, the glass on the bedside table was empty, and Draco Malfoy was asleep on top of the coverlet with his marked arm flung across his eyes. And Tonks, who told Hermione this later in a voice carefully stripped of significance, said that the bandage on his forearm had been retied neatly by hands that were not Madame Pomfrey's and were not Remus's, and could only, by elimination, have been his own. He had taken care of himself. It was the smallest thing. Hermione, sitting at the kitchen table that evening with a cup of tea she was not drinking, decided that it was not, in fact, a small thing at all. The dueling room was in the cellar. It had not been a dueling room when Sirius's mother had lived in the house. It had been a wine cellar, low-ceilinged and narrow, with stone walls that wept faintly in winter, and a flagged floor pitted by 2 centuries of dropped bottles. Moody had cleared it out in a single afternoon with a violence Hermione found impressive and slightly frightening. Chairs hurled into the corridor, racks pulled down, the floor scoured with a charm that left the stones smelling of hot iron. And by the following morning, he had warded the walls, hung practice targets at the far end, and pronounced it adequate. Adequate for what, Alastair? Sirius had said. For making sure the Malfoy boy doesn't get the rest of us killed when the time comes. That had been 6 days ago. Now Hermione stood at the foot of the stone stairs in her oldest robes, her hair tied back in a knot at the base of her neck, her wand in her hand, and she waited. The cellar was cold. The single brazier Moody had lit in the corner threw a thin, uncertain warmth that did not reach the corners. Practice dummies of straw and stitched leather hung from iron hooks along one wall. The other wall was bare grey stone, scorched in places, the marks of previous morning's work. The air smelled of ozone and burnt rope, and the faint, particular sweetness of healing potions, because Moody had a row of files lined up on a shelf by the door, and he had told her that first morning that she would be glad of them by the end of the week. She had been glad of them by the end of the first day. She heard the stairs before she saw him, the slow, uneven step, the catch of breath at the bottom, a small, almost inaudible thing, the involuntary noise of a body that had not yet relearned how to inhabit itself. Draco appeared in the doorway. He had been at this for 6 days. The bruise along his jaw from the third morning had faded to a yellow-green smudge. The cut across his eyebrow from the fourth morning had been sealed by Madame Pomfrey, but had left a thin pink line that bisected the arch of bone. He was wearing the same grey jumper. He had stopped pulling the cuff down over the bandage. The bandage itself was smaller now, neater, applied each morning with a precision that Hermione had begun to recognize as the only ritual he had left. He did not greet her. He had not greeted her on any of the previous 5 mornings either. He crossed to the center of the room. He rolled his shoulders. He shook out his wand hand. He looked, for the first time that morning, at her. Granger. Malfoy. Try not to take the eyebrow this time. Try not to leave it open. The corner of his mouth did something that was not, by any reasonable definition, a smile, but was perhaps the ghost of one, the place where a smile might have been, on a different face, in a different life. Moody was sitting on a stool by the brazier. He had not spoken since they had come in. He nodded once. That was the signal. They began. The first day, 6 mornings ago, had been a disaster. Moody had said duel, and Draco had raised his wand with the polished economy of someone who had been drilled in formal form since he was 7 years old, and Hermione had raised hers with the slightly stiffer formality of someone who had learned them from books, and for perhaps 15 seconds they had circled each other on the flagstones with the wary courtesy of 2 duelists at a ministry exhibition. Then Draco had thrown a curse at her face with the full force of every grievance he had ever held against her, and Hermione had thrown one back with the full force of every grievance she had ever held against him. And Moody had let it go on for almost 3 minutes before he had snapped enough, and they had both ended the morning bleeding. He had wanted to be hurt, she had understood afterwards. He had wanted her to hurt him. He had walked into the cellar with the bright, brittle resolve of someone who would rather be killed by an enemy than continue to be saved by one. And he had been trying, in the small theatre of those 3 minutes, to put a wand into her hand and a reason into her body and let her do it. She had refused. She had not understood at the time that she was refusing. She had only understood somewhere in the second minute that he was not defending himself properly, that his guard was dropping in the same place each time, that he was opening his ribs to her on every third exchange, that his shield charms were a half-second slow. And she had begun, without entirely meaning to throw curses that were not quite curses. Stinging hexes pulled at the last instant, a disarming charm aimed wide, a knockback jinx with half the force it should have had. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. He had stopped in the middle of the 3rd minute with his wand still raised and his chest heaving, and he had looked at her across the cellar with an expression she had not been able to read at the time and could only now, 6 days later, identify as fury. "Don't," he had said. "Don't what? Don't do that. Do what? Don't pull them, Granger. Don't you dare. If you're going to fight me, fight me." And she had stood there with her wand still raised and her breath coming hard and the strangest tightness in her throat. And she had said, very quietly, "I am fighting you. I'm just not killing you. Those are different things, Malfoy. You should learn the difference." Moody had called it off. That night, she had cried in the bathroom on the 3rd floor with the taps running, and she had not known why. On the 3rd morning, something had shifted. He had still come into the cellar with his shoulders set and his jaw tight, and the small, dreadful resolve in his eyes that suggested he had spent the night arguing himself into being here. But when Moody had said, "Begin," and they had circled each other on the flagstones, and Draco had raised his wand, he had cast a proper shield charm. It was a small thing. He had cast 100 shield charms in front of her over 5 years of defense against the dark arts. But this one had been cast properly, not as a thrown gesture, but as an act of deliberate self-preservation. And Hermione, who had been winding up for a disarming charm, had felt the small click of recognition somewhere beneath her sternum. He had decided to live. She did not know what had happened in the locked blue room between the 2nd morning and the 3rd. She did not know whether it had been a letter or a dream, or simply the slow grinding of a body that no longer had the strength to keep wanting to die. But she had watched him cast that shield charm, and she had understood that something had been decided, and she had thrown her disarming charm at his wand hand with the full strength of her arm. He had blocked it. By the end of the morning, they were both bleeding again, but this time they were bleeding from the work and not from anything else. This morning, the 6th, they had developed a rhythm. It surprised her every time how quickly 2 bodies could learn each other. He cast in tight, economical movements. She cast in slightly broader ones, more rooted in the shoulder. He favoured his left foot when pivoting. She favoured her right. He tilted his head a 1/4 inch to the side when he was about to throw a non-verbal, a tell so small that Moody himself had not flagged it until the 4th day. She drew breath through her nose when she was about to throw a shield charm, and through her mouth when she was about to throw a curse, a tell she had not known she had until Draco had exploited it twice in succession on the 5th morning, and Moody had barked Granger. "Your nose? Your nose? Fix it." Now, in the 6th morning's grey cellar light, they moved. Stinging hex from him, blocked. Disarming charm from her, dodged. Non-verbal knockback jinx from him. There, the head tilt, she saw it. Shield charm from her, raised in time. A small grunt of acknowledgement from him. A faint, fierce satisfaction in her chest. She countered with a bat bogey hex, learned from Ginny, slightly improvised in the wrist. He turned it aside with a flick that was almost contemptuous. He returned with a leg locker. She sidestepped. The flagstone behind her hissed where the curse struck. "Granger." His voice was even. He was barely out of breath. "Your left side. What about it?" "You drop it on the 3rd exchange. Every time. I do not. You do. Watch." He cast again, a stinging hex, easy, almost lazy, and she blocked it, and the next, and the next, and on the 3rd her wand wavered fractionally to the right, and his 4th curse, a non-verbal, fast, clipped her left shoulder and spun her half a step back against the stone wall. She caught her breath. The stinging hex was a small, hot fire under the skin of her shoulder. She did not lower her wand. "All right," she said. "All right. Show me." He blinked. It was the smallest possible thing, a single, surprised blink. But she saw it, because she had begun, in the past 6 days, to read his face the way she read difficult Latin. Slowly, attentively, with the constant awareness that a great deal depended on getting the meaning right. "Show you what?" he said. "The block. Show me what you're doing on the 3rd. You always counter the 3rd with a half step. Show me." He stared at her. Moody, from the stool by the brazier, said nothing. Hermione did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Draco. Draco lowered his wand. He walked across the cellar. The flagstones rang faintly under his boots. He came to within perhaps 4 feet of her and stopped. "Lift your arm," he said. "My wand arm. Lift it. Halfway, as if you were about to throw a shield." She lifted her arm. He took another step closer. She had not, she realized, been within 4 feet of Draco Malfoy on purpose since she was 12 years old. She had been within 4 feet of him on the astronomy tower stairs, and in the corridor outside Charms, and in the great hall at meals, but never on purpose, never with the deliberate, quiet attention of a man about to correct her form, and the air in the cellar between them did a small, strange thing, a tightening, a thinning, that she did not have a name for and decided instantly not to examine. He raised his own wand. He held it parallel to hers. He moved her wrist by perhaps 1/8 of an inch, not touching her, only indicating with the tip of his own wand the small adjustment. And he said, in a voice that was lower and more even than she had ever heard from him, "There, the angle. You're casting from the elbow on the 3rd. You need to cast from the wrist. Otherwise, the 2nd one telegraphs to the 3rd, and anyone reading you will take the opening. Do it again." She did it again, from the wrist. The shield charm bloomed, silver and bright in the cold air between them. It was tighter than her usual shield, more efficient. It used less magic. She felt the difference in her own arm before she had registered it intellectually. A kind of cleanness, a sharpening. "Oh," she said. He stepped back. He did not quite smile, but he tilted his head a 1/4 inch to the side. Not the tell, not the head tilt of the duel, but a smaller and more personal version of it. And he said very quietly, "Lucius, he hits like a hammer. You have to cast like a needle if you don't want to lose your wrist by the third exchange." It was the first time he had said his father's name in her hearing. The first time he had said it, perhaps, in anyone's hearing, since the night Snape had brought him through the front door. She did not say anything. She raised her wand again from the wrist, and she nodded to him to begin, and they moved. Moody, watching from the stool by the brazier, did not speak for the rest of the morning. When they came up the stairs an hour later, both of them bruised, both of them sweating, both of them moving with the slightly off-balance gait of bodies that had been pushed past their training and not yet recovered. They were not, precisely, walking together. There was still a half pace of distance between them on the steps. There was still no eye contact, but they were climbing the stairs in the same rhythm. Hermione noticed on the third step from the top that she had matched her pace to his without meaning to. She did not break it. He did not break it either. At the top of the stairs they parted without a word. She to the kitchen, he to the locked blue room where Tonks was waiting to turn the key behind him. And Hermione sat down at the kitchen table with shaking hands and a small, terrible warmth blooming somewhere beneath her ribs. And she thought, very clearly, with the particular cold clarity that had always been the curse and the gift of her own mind, "Oh, no." She did not finish the thought. She did not have to. The kettle began to whistle on the stove, and Molly came bustling in from the pantry, and Hermione folded her hands very carefully around her cup and did not allow the thought to finish itself for the rest of the afternoon. But it was there. It was there, and it was not going to go away, and she knew it. She found him in the library at 2:20 in the morning. She had not been looking for him. She had been looking for a book, specifically the second volume of Hexenwerk und Schildkunst, a 16th century German treatise on defensive magic that she had remembered halfway through a sleepless half hour of staring at the ceiling, contained a chapter on layered shield charms she had been meaning to study for a week. The Black family library on the third floor was the only place in the house that might have it. She had pulled her dressing gown over her nightdress, lit her wand to its dimmest setting, and gone down the corridor in her bare feet. The library door had been open. A thin band of candlelight had been spilling onto the runner. She had stopped in the doorway, and she had not gone in. He was sitting on the floor, not at the long table where Sirius's ancestors had presumably done whatever reading they had done, not in the leather wing chair by the cold fireplace, which would have been the obvious choice. On the floor, with his back against the lowest shelf of the north wall, his knees drawn up, a heavy folio open across his thighs, and a single tallow candle stuck in its own wax on the boards beside him. He had not looked up when she stopped in the doorway, but his shoulders had gone very still in the particular way of a person who has registered that they are no longer alone. "It's me," she said quietly. He turned a page. "I gathered." She stood there a moment longer. The candle threw a long, soft, shifting light up the wall behind him, and it touched the side of his face and turned the planes of his cheek and jaw into something that did not look, at this hour, like the boy who had spent 5 years calling her names in corridors. It looked like an etching of someone older, someone tired. "I was looking for a book," she said. "Of course you were. Hexenwerk und Schildkunst, the second volume, Bauer, 1583. He did not look up. He turned another page. After a long moment, he said, in a voice that was almost conversational, "Top shelf, west wall, third from the left. The bottom of the spine's been re-stitched so you'll spot it. The first volume's missing. The blacks sold it in 1840 to pay for someone's funeral." She blinked. "How do you know that?" He turned another page. "My grandmother," he said, "was a black." She had known this. She had known this for years, in the abstract, bookish way that one knew genealogies of pure-blood families, because they appeared in footnotes. She had not, until this moment, understood that it meant he had grown up being told stories about this house, that he had a child's memory of names on a tapestry she had been walking past for weeks without thinking, that somewhere in his own head, number 12 Grimold Place was not the headquarters of the Order, but the house his mother had visited as a girl. She crossed to the west wall. She did not turn her wand toward him. She kept her eyes on the shelves. She found the book exactly where he had said it would be. Top shelf, third from the left, the re-stitched spine catching her fingernail. And she pulled it down carefully because the leather was very old and very brittle, and she stood with it in her hands for a moment without moving. Then she did something she did not, even as she did it, entirely understand. She crossed back across the room. She sat down on the floor on the other side of the candle. She set the book in her lap. She drew her dressing gown more tightly around her knees. She did not look at him. She opened the book to the table of contents and began to read. He did not speak. He did not move. For perhaps 10 minutes, the only sound in the library was the soft rasp of pages turning. His, then hers, then his again, and the distant tick of the long case clock down on the first floor landing, and the very small wet hiss of the candle, which was old and not entirely well rendered. She found her chapter. She began to read it properly. The Latin was bad, and the diagrams were worse, and after a few minutes she found that she had read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it, because she was listening, with a quiet attention that had nothing to do with her conscious will, to the rhythm of his breathing on the other side of the candle. It was even. It was the slow, settled breath of a person who was not pretending to be calm, but had actually, somehow, in this small lit pocket of the third-floor library, become so. Granger. She looked up. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his own folio. The candlelight caught the place where the cut along his eyebrow had healed and left a thin pink seam. What? What are you reading? Bauer, the chapter on layered defenses. A pause. It's wrong, he said. What? The third diagram, the angle. He's got the wand tip pitched too high. It works in the woodcut, but it doesn't work in the air. You lose half the field. My father had us correct it when we were 9. She stared at him. You had to correct a 16th century German treatise when you were 9. It was Tuesdays, he said. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Latin on the other days. There was no boast in it. There was no self-pity in it. There was only the flat, slightly tired delivery of someone reporting a fact about a childhood that had happened to someone else, a long time ago, in a different house. She closed the book. She did not mean to. Her hand moved before she had thought it through. The folio shut against itself with a soft, heavy thud that sounded very loud in the quiet of the library. He glanced up. For perhaps the first time that night, they looked at each other properly. The candle was between them. The light, at this distance, was kind to both of them in ways that daylight had not been for weeks. She saw the smudge under his eye that was not a bruise, but the simple shadow of someone who had not slept properly in a month. He saw, presumably, the same thing on her own face, because something in his own expression softened by a fractional degree, a small, involuntary recognition. "Why are you on the floor?" she said. He looked down at his folio again. "The chair belonged to my great-uncle Pollux. I don't care for him. Even in absentia. Especially in absentia." She found herself, against every reasonable instinct, smiling. It was very small. She did not let it reach her eyes, but it was there in the corner of her mouth, and he saw it. He looked away from it very quickly. "Granger." "Yes." A pause. The candle hissed. "My mother," he said. He did not finish. She did not press. She watched the side of his face in the candlelight, and she watched the small muscle in his jaw move, and she watched him decide, slowly, with the deliberateness of a person picking up something fragile, whether or not to keep speaking. "She used to read to me in this house," he said. "When I was small, we came for Christmas the year I was 4, the year before my grandmother died. There was a window seat in the front parlour, the one with the green curtains. She used to sit there in the afternoons and read to me, Beadle the Bard, and other things, The Hare and the Hedgehog, things you wouldn't know. The Hare and the Hedgehog. It's a black family story. The hare insults the hedgehog over its short legs, and the hedgehog and his wife agree to a foot race. The hedgehog stations his wife at the end of the furrow. They look identical. The hare runs the field 100 times, and each time the hedgehog is at the end before him, because of course it isn't the same hedgehog, it's his wife. But the hare can't tell the difference, and at last he drops dead of exhaustion. That is a horrible story. It is a black family story. Why was your mother reading you black family stories at 4? He almost smiled. She saw the place where the smile would have been. It did not arrive. "Because," he said, "she didn't want me to grow up thinking that running faster than other people was the same thing as being cleverer than them." Hermione did not say anything. She thought, with a small private clarity that surprised her, that Narcissa Malfoy might be a different woman than she had supposed. The candle had burned down nearly an inch since she had come in. The wax was pooling against the floorboards. She would, she thought distantly, need to scrape it up before they left, or Mrs. Weasley would find it in the morning, and there would be a scene. "She is alive," Draco said. His voice had gone very quiet. He was looking at the candle, not at her. "Snape sent word 2 days ago. He has people in the house. She's alive. She is being watched. She is..." His jaw worked. "She is, for now, safe. Malfoy, that's..." "Don't," he said. "Don't say good news. It isn't. It is news that has not yet become bad. There is a difference." She did not say good news. She set the heavy folio aside, very carefully on the boards beside her. She did not move closer to him. She did not reach for him. She understood. with the slow, attentive understanding she'd been developing for 6 days now in the cellar, that he could not, at this moment, be reached for. She did, however, do one small thing. She held out her hand, palm up over the candle. She did not say anything. She did not look at him. It was not strictly an invitation. She did not entirely know what it was. It was the smallest possible gesture, a hand resting open in the space between them, half lit by tallow flame, the fingers slightly curled. And she let it stay there, and she went back to her book, and she did not look up. The candle hissed. The clock on the landing struck 3. After what felt like a very long time, she felt not a touch exactly, because he did not take her hand, but the faintest brush of air, the small displacement of warmth as he laid the back of his own hand against hers on the boards. Not palm to palm, not finger to finger, knuckle to knuckle. The barest acknowledgement that her hand existed in the world. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. They sat there in the candlelight, with the backs of their hands touching on the floor of a library full of dead blacks, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. When the candle began to gutter at last, perhaps 20 minutes later, perhaps an hour, she had lost track in a way she had not lost track of time since she was a child. He withdrew his hand, slowly, and she withdrew hers, slowly, and they both stood up without speaking. He scraped the wax off the boards with the side of his thumb. She slid the folio back onto its shelf. At the door of the library, they paused. "Granger." "Yes." He did not look at her. He was looking at the door frame. "Thank you," he said, "for not asking me anything." She nodded, though he was not looking at her to see it. They walked down the corridor together, and at the head of the stairs they parted. He up to the blue room on the 2nd floor, she down to the small room she shared with Ginny on the 1st. And neither of them said good night, because the word would have been too large for what had just happened, and would also have been too small. She lay in her bed in the dark and listened to Ginny breathing. She did not sleep. She put the back of her own hand against her cheek, very carefully, where his knuckles had rested against hers, and she held it there for a long time, and she understood that something had been built in the library tonight that was not going to be unbuilt, that whatever it was, however small, however slow, it had been laid down on the boards of a black family library in candlelight, and it was now part of the architecture of her life, and there was no honest way to pretend otherwise. She closed her eyes. Outside the window, the autumn wind moved through Grimmauld Square, and somewhere in the city a clock struck 4, and Hermione Granger lay awake in the dark with her hand against her cheek, and decided, with the same quiet, attentive clarity with which she did everything that mattered, that she was going to stop pretending. Not out loud, not yet, not to anyone, but to herself. She was going to stop pretending. She was going to let herself know what she knew. It was, she thought, the smallest possible courage, and it was, also, the only one that was hers to give. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came by an owl Hermione did not recognize, a small, sharp-eyed brown thing with a frayed primary feather on its left wing, the sort of owl one rented from a back-alley post in Nocturne Alley when one did not wish to be traced. It dropped through the kitchen window at 20 minutes past 7 in the morning, deposited a single folded square of cream-coloured parchment onto the buttered toast on Sirius's plate, and was gone again before anyone had finished registering its arrival. Sirius looked at the parchment. He looked at Remus. He looked at the parchment again. "It's for him," he said. "Isn't it?" The handwriting on the front was small, slanted, perfectly disciplined. Hermione, sitting 2 seats down with a cup of tea halfway to her mouth, recognized the handwriting before she had consciously identified what she was looking at, because she had spent the previous week transcribing answers given in that same handwriting's owner's son's voice. DM. 2 letters. No address, no surname, no flourish. The kitchen had gone very quiet. "Snape's channel," Remus said. "It must be. Nobody else could have got it through." "Open it," said Moody from the end of the table. Sirius's hand twitched toward the parchment. He did not pick it up. After a long moment, he said, "No, we'll take it up to him." "Sirius." "No, Alastair. I am not opening a letter from a woman in that house to her 16-year-old son in this house, in front of a kitchen full of people who haven't earned the right to read it. Take it up. Let him decide what he wants us to know." It was the most generous thing Hermione had ever heard Sirius Black say in his life, and she sat in her chair with her tea cooling in her hand and understood, with a small sharp lift beneath her sternum, that the house had changed, that all of them had, that whatever was happening on the 2nd floor in the locked blue room had been happening to all of them, slowly, for nearly 4 weeks now, and was no longer something that could be undone by anyone sitting at this table. "I'll take it," she said. 3 heads turned toward her. She set down her cup. "I'm on the 8 o'clock shift anyway. I'll take it." Sirius looked at her for a long, considering moment. The grey-black eyes were very still. "All right," he said at last. He picked up the parchment and held it out across the table toward her. "Take it." She took it. It weighed almost nothing. She knocked. "Granger," he said from inside before she had spoken. He had learned her knock. She had not known, until that moment, that he had learned her knock, and the small piece of information lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there. "I have something," she said to the door. From the channel. It came this morning." A silence. Then the soft sound of footsteps on the boards and the lock turning from the inside. Sirius had given him the key 3 days ago with a curtness that had not quite managed to conceal the meaning of the gesture. And the door opened. He was dressed. He had been awake for some time. The grey jumper had been replaced today with a clean white shirt that did not belong to him and which fit him badly across the shoulders. His hair was damp at the temples. He had, she noted with the small attentive part of her mind that had been noticing everything about him for weeks now, been reading. There was a book open on the bed behind him, and a quill on the bedside table, and a half-drunk cup of tea that had gone cold. She held out the letter. He looked at it. He did not move to take it. "Hers," he said. "I think so. Yes." He took it. His hand was steady. He did not look at her. He turned and walked to the window. Sirius had unwarded it the previous week, and the high autumn light came through the streaked glass and threw a long, pale rectangle onto the boards. And he stood there with his back to her and broke the seal. She did not, at first, leave. She knew she should. She knew that a letter from a mother to her son did not need a witness from the order standing in the doorway. She turned to go. Granger. She stopped. Stay. She did not understand the word for perhaps a full second. When she did, she discovered that her hand had gone very tight on the doorframe. Are you sure? No, he said. His voice was very even. Stay anyway. She stayed. She did not come further into the room. She closed the door quietly behind her. She stood with her back against the wood, and she watched him at the window in the long, pale rectangle of autumn light, with the parchment held in both hands at the level of his chest. He read. He read for a long time. The parchment was not a long letter, perhaps 2 folded sides at most. But he read it slowly, and then he read it again, and then he read it a 3rd time. And Hermione, standing against the door with her hands folded in front of her, so that she would not do anything with them she had not given herself permission to do, watched the side of his face change. The first reading. No expression at all. The careful blankness he had worn for the Veritaserum sessions. The second reading. A single muscle moving in the jaw. The third reading. His eyes closed, briefly, and his shoulders dropped, not in relief, not in grief, but in the small, terrible way of a body that has been holding itself up against a wall for a very long time, and has just understood that the wall is going to hold it after all. He folded the letter. He folded it once. He folded it twice. He folded it a 3rd time into a small, precise square, and he closed his hand around it, and he stood at the window for a long moment with his fist pressed against his own sternum, and he did not turn around. Granger, he said. Yes. She is alive. Yes. She has been moved to a safe house in France. Snape arranged it. He sent the right people at the right hour, and she went. Malfoy. That's... She went, he said. His voice cracked just slightly on the second word, and she understood at last what was happening in him, and it was not relief. It was the much harder thing that lived underneath relief, the place where a person had been preparing for weeks to be alone in the world, and had just been told with one folded square of cream-coloured parchment that they were not going to have to be. She did not say anything. She did not move toward him. She had learned in a candle-lit library at 3 in the morning that he could not be reached for, that he had to be allowed to do the reaching in his own time, at the angle of his own choosing. She waited. After a long moment, he said, without turning around, "She wrote that she is sorry. She wrote that she is sorry she did not move. That night, in the doorway, when Bellatrix..." He stopped. He breathed. "She wrote that she has been sorry every hour since. Malfoy. She wrote that she is proud of me, Granger, for going, with Snape, for not finishing what was asked." She closed her eyes. She did not know, even now, what to say. The thing she wanted to say. Of course she is proud of you. Of course. Of course, you stupid, beautiful, stubborn idiot. Of course she is proud of you. Was not a thing she could say, because she did not have the right to use those words about him, and would not have, even if she had wanted to. So she said, instead, very quietly, what she could say. "I'm glad she is safe." He turned around. The autumn light was behind him, and it set fire to the pale, fine hair at his temples, and it caught the edge of the white shirt collar against his throat, and his eyes, the pewter underwater eyes, The eyes she had been carefully not looking at for weeks now were very bright. He was not crying. She did not think he had cried in a very long time, and possibly not since he was a child, and possibly not even then. But the eyes were very bright. "Granger," he said. She did not say anything. He crossed the room. He did it slowly. He did not, she understood, entirely know what he was doing. He had the small folded square of his mother's letter in his left hand, still pressed to his sternum, and his right hand hung loose at his side, and he walked across the boards in the autumn light, like a man walking toward a doorway he was not sure he was permitted to enter. He stopped perhaps 2 feet from her. She did not move from the door. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. The light from the window fell at an angle across the boards between them. The house around them was making the small distant sounds of morning. Mrs. Weasley in the kitchen, a kettle whistling, Sirius's heavy step on the stairs somewhere below, and the locked blue room with its single high window was, for that long suspended moment, the only quiet room in England. He lifted his right hand. He did it slowly. He did not, even then, touch her. He raised his hand, and he stopped it perhaps an inch from her own, which was, she realized, by now resting against her collarbone in a small involuntary gesture she had not given herself permission to make. And he held it there, in the inch of air between them, with the same careful, suspended attentiveness with which she had held her own hand over a candle in a library 4 nights ago. It was, she understood, an answer. She lowered her hand from her collarbone. She did it slowly. She turned the palm upward. She held it open between them. He laid his palm against hers. That was all. There was no clasp, no interlacing of fingers. There was only the flat, warm contact of one palm against another, the small, dry warmth of his hand against the small, dry warmth of hers, and the pulse in his wrist beating against the heel of her thumb, and the very slight tremor that ran the length of his arm and into her own and stayed there. He bent his forehead. He rested it against hers. He did it the way one rests a forehead against the cool jamb of a doorway one has been standing in front of for a long time, with a kind of exhausted gratitude, with no demand and no expectation, with the small surrender of a body that has finally permitted itself to lean. Her eyes closed. She did not mean for them to. They simply closed, the way a hand closes around something offered to it, the way a window closes against weather, the way a body did, sometimes, what the body had been wanting to do for weeks without telling the mind. She did not raise her other hand. She did not move at all. She let him stand there, with his forehead against hers and his palm against hers, and the small folded square of his mother's letter still pressed between his left fist and his sternum. And she let the autumn light fall across the boards beside them, and she let the house make its distant kitchen sounds beneath them, and she did not move. She thought, with a clarity that had nothing in it of triumph and nothing in it of regret, "Oh, there it is then. That is what it is." He did not kiss her. She did not kiss him. It was, both of them understood without speaking, not yet the time. But he stayed. He stayed with his forehead against hers and his palm against hers, for what was perhaps a full minute, and perhaps 3. She did not measure it. She did not let herself measure it. and when at last he lifted his head and stepped back, he did it without breaking her gaze, and his eyes were still very bright, and he was looking at her in a way that no one had ever looked at her before in her life. And she discovered that she had been holding her breath, and that she did not entirely know how to begin again. He let go of her hand. He stepped back. He said very quietly, "Thank you." She nodded. She did not, this time, even try to speak. She turned. She opened the door behind her. She stepped out into the corridor. She closed the door very gently between them. She walked the length of the second-floor corridor to the top of the stairs. She sat down on the top step. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She did not laugh either, though something in her chest was doing a strange small thing that was related to both, and that did not yet have a name. She sat at the top of the stairs in the autumn morning with her face in her hands, and she breathed in and out, and she understood, with the slow, attentive clarity that had been her one true and reliable instrument all her life, that the architecture of her world had been rearranged very gently by a single palm and a single forehead and a single folded letter, and that she was not going to be able to pretend any longer, even to herself, that she had not chosen this. She had chosen it. She had chosen it the night she had laid her hand against his cold cheek in the foyer. She had chosen it the morning she had said you stopped into the wood of a locked door. She had chosen it on the floor of a library with the back of his hand against the back of hers in candlelight. She was choosing it now. And somewhere in France, in a safe house she had never seen, a woman who had not moved in a doorway was, perhaps, at this hour, sitting at a window and writing her name on a second folded square of cream-coloured parchment. And the war was still coming, and Hogwarts was still standing, and none of it, was going to be enough to undo what had just been laid down in a locked room on the second floor of number 12 Grimmauld Place, between the back of one palm and the back of another. Hermione Granger lifted her face from her hands. She stood up. She went downstairs to the kitchen and she poured herself another cup of tea, and her hand, when she set the cup back on its saucer, was perfectly steady, and Molly Weasley smiled at her across the kitchen with the soft, worried smile she had been smiling for a week, and Hermione smiled back. The smile, for the first time in a month, reached her eyes. They came for Hogwarts in the first hour of May. The summons reached Grimmauld Place at 9:30 on a Friday evening through a Patronus that arrived in the form of a silver weasel and spoke in Bill Weasley's clipped voice and said only 2 words: "It's begun." The house, which had been holding its breath for 9 months, exhaled all at once. Hermione was in the kitchen when the Patronus came. So was Draco. They had been, for perhaps a quarter of an hour, sitting opposite each other at the long scarred table with a chessboard between them and a cup of tea, each going cold beside their elbows. And they had not, in that quarter of an hour, spoken more than 4 words to each other. Your move, twice, once from each of them. And the silence had been the comfortable, deliberate silence of 2 people who had learned, over the course of a long winter and a longer spring, that they did not need to fill the air between them with anything that was not necessary. The weasel spoke. It dissolved. Draco was on his feet before Hermione had reached for her wand. His chair scraped back across the flagstones with a noise like a struck flint. The chess pieces, sensing the shift in the room, drew themselves up into their starting positions on their own initiative and went very still. "Get moody," he said. His voice had gone flat and clean. "I'll get my cloak." She nodded. She did not need to be told. They had drilled this for months. Every contingency, every signal, every order of operations. And the drills had not been a kindness from Moody, but a necessity, because both of them had known, in the quiet places of their own minds, that when the summons came, it would come without warning, and they would have, at most, 4 minutes between knowing and going. She made it to the stairs in 12 seconds. She had Moody up and the rest of the house up in another 2 minutes, and by the time she was back in the kitchen with her travelling cloak fastened and her wand in her hand and the small leather pouch of files Madame Pomfrey had drilled her on hanging at her hip, Draco was already at the back door with his own cloak on and his hood up, and his face composed into the particular blank, disciplined stillness she had come to recognize as the face he wore when he had decided that the alternative was unacceptable. He looked at her across the kitchen. He did not say anything. He held out his hand. She crossed the kitchen and put hers into it. He closed his fingers around hers, not tightly, not possessively, just firmly enough that she understood she was not going to be allowed to let go. And Moody, behind her, said, "Go," and they went. The side along to the boundary of Hogsmeade was the worst Hermione had ever experienced. She did not think it was Moody's fault. Moody was the best apparator she knew. It was simply that they were apparating into the perimeter of a battle, and the air at the perimeter of a battle did not want to be travelled through. And the magic that pulled her body through space pulled it through something thick and resistant and faintly screaming. And when they landed on the cold turf at the edge of the forest, she went to her knees and was sick into the grass. Draco was on his knees beside her. He had not been sick, but his hand was on her back, between her shoulder blades, and it was the steady, planted hand of a person who had also been on his knees half a second earlier and had simply got upright faster. "Breathe," he said. "Breathe. In through your nose. Granger, breathe." She breathed. She got up. The castle was a long way off across the slope, and it was on fire. Not the whole castle, not yet, but pieces of it. A tower along the east wall was wreathed in green flame, and a long curl of smoke was rising from somewhere near the entrance hall, and the sky above the battlements was the sick electric mauve of a sky in which a great deal of magic was being released into the air at once. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was looking at her. His hood had fallen back. His pale hair was visible in the dark, which was a problem they had discussed in the cellar more than once, and which he had said, with a particular dry stubbornness he had developed in her company over the winter, that he did not intend to die. "Ready," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. Stay on my left. I know. Wrist, not elbow. I know, Malfoy. Granger." "What?" He did not say it, whatever it was. He looked at her with the long pale planes of his face washed in the green light of a distant burning tower, and his eyes the colour of pewter under water. And he did not say it, and she did not need him to say it, because she had understood what it was somewhere around the 3rd week of February, and she had been waiting, with a patience that surprised her, for the moment when he would understand it too. He understood it now. She saw it land. He nodded, just once, a quarter inch, and turned, and they went. She did not remember most of the battle afterwards. She remembered fragments. She remembered the corridor outside the Charms classroom, where a Death Eater she did not know had risen up out of the smoke in front of her, and Draco had taken his legs out from under him before she had finished raising her wand. She remembered the staircase to the 7th floor, half collapsed, and the way they had gone up it together, her on his left, exactly as he had said, her wand arms sweeping the high ground while his swept the low, and the way they had moved without speaking, in the rhythm they had built in a cold cellar over 28 mornings. She remembered passing Harry once, in a corridor full of dust, and the way Harry had looked at the two of them, at her on his left, at the rhythm of them, at the small unconscious arc of Draco's wand sweeping the floor for tripwires, and the way Harry had said, "into the smoke," without breaking stride, "Granger, East Wing, go." He had said Granger, not Hermione, because there was no time, but he had not said "get away from him," and he had not said "come with us," and the absence of those things had been, in its way, the largest thing Harry had ever given her. She had nodded at him through the dust, and Draco beside her had given Harry the smallest possible jerk of his chin. A half nod, an acknowledgement, the bare minimum two boys could exchange when one of them had spent 6 years calling the other names, and the other had spent 6 years not forgiving him for it. And Harry had vanished back into the smoke with Ron at his shoulder, and she had not seen them again until afterwards. She remembered also the corridor outside the room of requirement. That was where it happened. She had taken a cutting curse to the ribs. She did not know who had thrown it. She thought, afterwards, that it had been one of the Carrows, a low, scything thing thrown from a doorway behind her, and she had felt the bright, hot line of it open across her side before she had registered the sound. She had stumbled. She had gone down to one knee against the wall. Her hand had gone to her ribs and come away red, and the world had done a small, slow tilt at the edges, and she had thought, with a strange detachment, that is rather a lot of blood for that quickly. Draco had seen. She had seen him see. He had been 3 paces ahead of her, sweeping the corridor, and he had turned at the small, involuntary sound she had made, a sound she had not known she was going to make. And his face had done a thing she had never seen it do before. It had gone, for half a second, completely undefended. Every wall he had ever built had simply not been there, and what was underneath the walls had been visible to her in the corridor light, and what was underneath was, well, she knew now what was underneath. She had known for a long time. Then the walls came back, and he came back, and he closed the 3 paces between them in a stride and a half. "Granger, I'm all right. You are not all right. Malfoy, behind you." He turned. He turned in the small, fractional way that her warning had brought him, and the curse that had been meant for the back of his skull caught him across the shoulder instead, and she heard the sound it made when it struck him, which was a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. He went down. He went down on one knee beside her against the wall, and His wand arm, the right one, the one that had been swept up to turn, was hanging at a wrong angle, and there was a long, ragged tear across the shoulder of his cloak, and underneath the tear there was— She did not look. She did not look closely. She did not have to. The smell of it was enough. Malfoy. I'm all right. You are not. Granger, down. She went down. A second curse, pale green, badly aimed, passed through the air where her head had been and struck the wall opposite and threw a long line of stone shrapnel into the corridor. She felt a piece of it open a small, thin line across her temple. She did not feel it as pain. She felt it as wet. Draco's left hand, his offhand, his bad casting hand, the hand he had spent 6 months teaching to cast almost as well as the right, because his father had drilled him in ambidexterity from the age of 6, came up with his wand in it, and he threw a curse down the corridor that she did not recognize the incantation of, and would never, afterwards, ask him to teach her. And the doorway the carrow had been firing from went, briefly, very quiet. He sagged. He put his good shoulder against the wall, and he sagged, and his hand, the left one, the wand hand, found hers on the floor between them. He laced his fingers through hers. He did it deliberately. It was the first time he had ever interlaced his fingers with hers, and she understood, with the same slow, attentive clarity with which she had understood everything that mattered, that he was doing it because he was not sure he was going to be able to do it later. Granger, I'm here. Stay. I'm here, Malfoy. His eyes were closing. She drew her wand hand up, her own right hand, the one that was not laced through his, and she pressed it against the tear in his shoulder, and she said, in a voice that came out level only because she made it come out level, the incantation Madame Pomfrey had drilled her on for 3 weeks in the kitchen at Grimmauld. Vulnera sanentur. The first pass, the second, the third. The bleeding slowed. It did not stop. The curse had been a dark one, and Vulnera sanentur was a clean spell, and the two did not entirely speak to each other, but it was enough. It was enough to buy them the time. She turned her own body sideways against the wall, and she got her arm under his good shoulder, and she said into his ear, "Stay with me, Malfoy, stay. I am staying. Open your eyes." He opened them. The pewter underwater grey was a little fogged at the edges, but the eyes were there, and they were looking at her. "Granger," he said. "Yes. I am going to tell you something. Tell me later." "No." "Later, Malfoy." "No. Granger. Now. Because you will not believe me later. You will think I said it because I was bleeding, and I am telling you now while I can still phrase it properly so that you will know I said it because I meant it." She did not breathe. "What?" she said. He looked at her. The corridor was burning at the far end. The smoke was rolling slowly toward them along the ceiling. Somewhere very far away, there was a sound that might have been the West Tower coming down. His good hand was laced through hers. The bad shoulder was bleeding through her fingers, slow but steady, and the smell of it was iron and ozone, and the faint, sweet, rotten edge of dark magic. And the worst night of her life was happening in real time around the two of them, where they were sitting against a wall on a floor in a school she had loved since she was 11 years old. "You," he said. His voice cracked on the word. He swallowed and tried again. You, Granger, only you. From the doorstep, from the moment you put your hand on my face in that foyer and told Potter I was a person. From before that, probably. From a long time before that, probably. And I did not know it, and I would have died not knowing it if Snape had not. But he did, Granger, he did. And I am here, and I am telling you, only you. From the doorstep onward and for as long as I have left, only you. She made a sound. It was a very small sound. It was not a word. She bent her head. She rested her forehead against his, the way he had rested his forehead against hers in a locked blue room in a square of autumn light 7 months ago. And she closed her eyes, and she said, into the small breath of air between his mouth and hers, "You absolute, unbelievable idiot. You wait until now. You wait until you are bleeding on a floor." "Granger." "What?" "Say it back, please." She said it back. She said it into the half-inch of air between his mouth and hers, in a voice that did not crack only because she would not permit it to crack. And when she had said it, she did the thing she had been not quite doing for 9 months. She closed the half-inch. She kissed him. It was brief. It was not, could not be, the kiss either of them had earned. The corridor was burning. His shoulder was bleeding through her fingers. They were going to have to stand up in a moment and finish the war. But she kissed him, and he kissed her back, and his good hand came up and cupped the side of her jaw with a tenderness that she would remember for the rest of her life, with a clarity that would never blur. And for the space of one breath, the corridor and the smoke and the war and the school and every voice in her head that had ever told her this was impossible went, very briefly, silent. Then she drew back. She put her hand against his shoulder again. She cast Vulnera Sanitur a 4th time. She got her arm back under his good side. "Up," she said. "Granger. Up, Malfoy. We finish this. Together. Up." He got up. She got up with him. They went, together, down the burning corridor toward the rest of the battle. Her on his left, exactly as he had said, her wand arms sweeping the high ground while his bad shoulder leaned, just slightly, against hers. And somewhere ahead of them, somewhere in the wreck of the great hall, the war was deciding itself, and they were going to it together, on their own 2 feet, in their own rhythm. And they were going to live, or they were going to die, but they were going to do it side by side. The smoke closed behind them. The corridor was empty. The school burned on. The infirmary smelled of bergamot and bruise paste, and Hermione woke into it slowly, the way a swimmer rises from a long, deep dive, pressure releasing in stages, the surface a long way above, the light brightening by increments she could measure. She did not, at first, remember where she was. She knew only that there was a warm weight against the back of her right hand, and that the warm weight was moving very slightly, in, out, with the unmistakable rhythm of a person breathing in their sleep. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of the hospital wing was very high, and the morning light coming through the long windows was the particular thin gold of early May. A vase of bluebells stood on the bedside table. Luna had brought them. She would learn later, which would surprise her less than it ought to have done. And beyond the bluebells, slumped forward in a wooden chair that had been pulled too close to the bed, With his bandaged shoulder propped against an awkward stack of pillows and his good hand laid open across the back of hers, was Draco Malfoy, asleep. He looked, she thought with a small foolish clarity, terrible. There was a butterfly stitch above his eyebrow that Madame Pomfrey had not yet had the chance to dissolve. The shadow under his eye had deepened from blue to nearly black. His hair was clean, someone had washed it for him, but it was sticking up at the back in a way she had never seen before, the way ordinary hair did on ordinary people who had slept in chairs, and the absurd small ordinariness of it did something to her chest that she did not have the energy yet to examine. His good hand was very warm against hers. She did not move it. She lay there for what was perhaps a full minute, watching him sleep in the morning light, and she counted the things that were true. She was alive. He was alive. The war was over. She had heard last night through the fog of a dreamless sleep that Madame Pomfrey had brought her down with at perhaps 2 a.m, that Harry had walked into the great hall with Voldemort's body at his feet, and the elder wand snapped in 2 over his knee. She did not yet know who else had lived, and who had not, and the small cold place in her chest that knew there would be names was waiting, very patiently, for her to be strong enough to ask for them. But she was alive. He was alive. The morning had come. She turned her head very slightly on the pillow. He opened his eyes. He did it the way he did everything now, without dramatics, without performance, the lashes simply lifting, and the pewter underwater grey simply arriving in the world. And he looked at her across the bluebells, and a small, slow expression crossed his face that she had never, in her life, seen on it before. It was relief. Just that. Plain and unfortified. The face of a person who had been preparing, during a long night in a wooden chair, to wake up and find that he had imagined her, and who had just been informed by the world that he had not. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy. You're awake." "I am. Don't move." "I wasn't going to." His thumb moved against the back of her hand. It was a very small motion. He probably did not know he was doing it. She decided not to tell him. "How long was I out?" she said. 20 hours. Roughly. Pomfrey wanted longer, but you started to surface at about 4, and she said she wouldn't push you back under twice. You sat there for 20 hours. I sat there for 14. I was unconscious for 6. In the chair. In the bed next to yours. They moved me when I woke up. I declined to stay. You declined. Politely. She closed her eyes. She was smiling. She did not entirely know that she was smiling until she felt the corner of her mouth pull. It was not, perhaps, the smile she had imagined herself smiling on the morning after the war, but it was the smile that had arrived, and she let it stay. "Harry," she said, eyes still closed. "Alive. Tired. He's been in twice." "Twice?" "Once at 6 this morning. Once again about an hour ago. He stood at the foot of your bed. He looked at me. I looked at him. He nodded. I nodded. He left. That's quite a lot from him." "I thought so." "Ron. Alive. He cried. Not in front of me. He cried in front of you while you were asleep. He said..." Draco's voice did something small and dry. "He said, 'Thanks, Malfoy,' on his way out. I have not yet recovered." "He said thanks." "He did. I have considered preserving it in a file." She laughed. It was a very small laugh, and it caught in her ribs where the cutting curse had opened her up, and she winced, and his hand tightened around hers. Not tightly enough to hurt, just tightly enough to remind her that he was there. And she lay back against the pillow and breathed in and out until the catch in her ribs subsided. "Tell me," she said. "Granger, tell me. The list. Who? I need to know." He told her. He did it gently. He did it slowly. He did not soften any of it, because he had understood in the 7 months of her company that softening anything for her was an insult he could not afford to offer. But he laid it out for her with the kind of careful, precise grief that one used for friends. Fred, Tonks, Remus, Colin, Lavender, Snape, who had not, in the end, survived the battle in the Shrieking Shack, but whose name had been spoken that morning by Harry in the Great Hall in front of the whole of the school, and entered into the record of the war on the side of the saved. She wept. She wept quietly, with her hand still in his, and he did not move and did not speak, and did not in any way try to stop her, because he had understood. Somewhere on the floor of the Black family library at 3 in the morning, perhaps, or somewhere on the boards of a locked blue room in autumn light, that the right thing to do in the presence of a Hermione Granger who needed to weep was to allow her to weep and to keep one's hand exactly where she had put it. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her free hand. "Your mother," she said. "Here." She blinked. "Here." "In the castle. Snape's people brought her over from France 2 days ago, when it became clear what was going to happen. She arrived during the battle. She was the one who... Well, there was a moment with Potter in the forest. I will tell you about it later. She is here. She is downstairs. She has been told that I am all right. She has not yet been told." He paused. "She has not yet been told about you." "About me?" "About... yes." He was looking at her with a very particular composure. The composure of a man who had decided, sometime during the small hours of his vigil in the wooden chair, that he was going to say what he meant from now on without flinching, because flinching had nearly cost both of them everything they had, and he was finished with it. "Granger." "Yes." "What I said. In the corridor, while I was bleeding." "Yes." "It stands." "I know. In daylight, without curses, without..." He gestured slightly with his bad shoulder and winced. "Without the rather convenient excuse of imminent death. It stands. I know, Malfoy. I want to be sure that you know." "I know." He looked at her a moment longer. Then, very carefully, he lifted her hand from the coverlet and turned it over in his own and bent his head and pressed his mouth against the inside of her wrist. It was a small kiss. It was not a performance. It was the press of his mouth, briefly, against the place where her pulse beat under the thin skin, and the touch of it travelled up her arm and into her chest, and rearranged something there with a small final click that she felt very distinctly as a piece of architecture falling into its proper place. He raised his head. He laid her hand back down on the coverlet. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Narcissa came in at noon. Hermione, who had been propped up against a small mountain of pillows and fed broth by a Madame Pomfrey who would not be argued with, watched her arrive from the doorway with a careful, unhurried attentiveness. Narcissa Malfoy was thinner than she had been in the photographs. Her pale hair was bound at the nape of her neck in a plain knot, without ornament. She was wearing a travelling dress of grey wool that did not, by even the most generous reading, belong to her. And Hermione understood, with a small lift of something almost like fondness, that the dress had been borrowed from Andromeda Tonks, because there were no Malfoy clothes left in any house in England that had not been searched. Narcissa stopped at the foot of the bed. She looked at her son. She looked at her son's hand, which was resting on the coverlet next to Hermione's, the two of them touching at the knuckle in the small, unconscious way that they had been touching at the knuckle for hours now. She looked at Hermione. Hermione, who had decided some weeks ago that she was not any more going to be frightened of pure-blood drawing rooms or the women who came out of them, looked back. "Miss Granger," Narcissa said. "Mrs. Malfoy." A pause. "I have been told," Narcissa said in a voice of impeccable composure, "that you held the line at my son's left side for 9 hours of the battle, and that you cast Vulnera Sanentor over a curse wound in his shoulder 4 times in a corridor under fire, and that you were yourself bleeding from the ribs when you did it." "Yes." "I have also been told," Narcissa said, "by Severus before he died, in a note he left with his solicitor to be opened in the event of his death, that you sat in a corridor outside a locked bedroom in number 12 Grimold Place on the first night my son was there, and did not move from it until dawn." Hermione did not speak. She had not known that Snape had known. She thought, with a small private warmth, that of course he had known. Of course he had. He had been the one who told her not to look at Draco while he was under Veritaserum. He had been the one who had said he will be frightened. He will not show it. You must understand the difference. He had been telling her, in that doorway, that he had seen what she had not yet seen. He had also, perhaps, been asking her, in his way, which was not the way of other people, to take over. Narcissa was still looking at her. "My son," Narcissa said, "is alive because Severus Snape decided that he should be. He's alive today because you decided the same thing. I do not, Miss Granger. I do not have, at this moment, the resources to offer you what you are owed. I do not yet know how to be the kind of woman who can offer it. But I am going to learn. You should know that. I am going to learn." She inclined her head. It was a very small inclination. It was the smallest possible courtesy. But Hermione, who had been raised by her mother to know what the smallest possible courtesy meant in the mouth of a woman who had been raised to give nothing without consideration, returned it. "Mrs. Malfoy," she said. "Narcissa." Narcissa. That was all. Narcissa stayed perhaps a quarter of an hour. She spoke quietly with her son. She rested the back of her hand once against his cheek. In the same gesture, Hermione realized that she herself had used on the foyer floor at Grimold Place 9 months ago, and which she now understood was a black family gesture, and which Narcissa had taught her son to recognize as love before he had been old enough to remember being taught. And then she left. She did not look back, but at the door she paused, and she said over her shoulder, without turning, "Miss Granger, Hermione, come for tea. When you are well, I should like that." She was gone before Hermione had answered. Draco was smiling. It was a very small smile. She had never before seen him smile properly. The smile rearranged his entire face into a thing she did not entirely recognize, and she discovered that she was going to need quite a lot of time to get used to it, and that she was going to enjoy the project. They walked in the courtyard a week later. The sky was the bright washed blue of late spring. The flagstones were warm under their feet. Hermione's ribs were still healing. Madame Pomfrey had been firm about no apparating, no running, no climbing of stairs. And Draco's shoulder was in a sling that he was supposed to be wearing, and was not, because he had said, with the particular dry stubbornness she had come to recognize as the bedrock of his character, that he was not going to walk through the courtyard of the school in front of the surviving student body with his arm in a sling, like a wounded soldier in a romantic painting. She had laughed at him. She had let him win. They walked slowly. They walked the perimeter of the courtyard once, and then they walked it again, and at the far corner, where the wisteria had begun, despite everything, to bloom against the south wall, and the small fountain that the Carrows had cracked was now mended and running again. He stopped. He turned to face her. He did not say anything. She did not say anything either. She lifted her face, and he bent his, and he kissed her, properly this time, in the bright daylight of a courtyard that had been a battlefield 7 days before, with no curses falling, and no blood on either of their hands, and no folded letters pressed between their fists and their sternums. And she kissed him back, and his good hand came up and cradled the side of her jaw, the way it had done in a corridor full of smoke. And the kiss was not brief, and was not desperate, and was not the kiss of two people who thought one of them might die in the next quarter of an hour, and was, instead, the kiss of two people who had decided to live. When they drew back, his forehead rested against hers. He breathed out. It was a very long breath. It was the breath of a person who had been holding it for 9 months. Granger. Yes. I want to take you to my mother's house in a fortnight. When you are stronger, there are gardens. There is a window seat. I want to read to you in the window seat. Beadle the Bard, The Hare and the Hedgehog, the things she read to me. I want to begin. All right. Malfoy. Yes. Call me Hermione. He stepped back, just enough to look at her properly. The pewter underwater eyes were very bright in the sun. Hermione, he said. It sounded in his mouth like a word he had been practicing in the privacy of his own head for a long time, and had been waiting for the right hour to use. She smiled at him. It was the same smile she had given Molly across the kitchen table in October, the morning after a folded letter and a single palm and a single forehead in a square of autumn light, the smile that reached her eyes. And it was, today, in the courtyard, larger. He took her hand. She let him. They walked in the bright washed blue of the late spring morning, the long, slow length of the courtyard together, in the rhythm they had built in a cold cellar over 28 mornings, and refined in a corridor full of smoke, and were now, at last, permitted to use for nothing more dangerous than walking. And the school stood up around them, scarred and standing, and the war was over, and the road ahead was theirs. They walked it together. They were going to keep walking it together. That was the ending. That was, finally, the ending. And it was. Both of them understood without needing to say it. Only the beginning. the window seat in the south parlour of the Tonks Black estate, for that was what it had become. In the end, the deed quietly transferred from Andromeda's name to Narcissa's, and back again over a long autumn of solicitors' letters and the kind of patient legal work the two sisters undertake when they have decided to begin again, faced west. It caught the late afternoon light. It was a deep seat, cushioned in faded green velvet that had been there since before any of them were born, with a sash window that opened onto a small walled garden in which Narcissa had, over the course of the summer, coaxed a great deal of unlikely lavender into bloom. There was a low table beside it. There was a tea service on the low table. There was a book on the cushion, open and face down, the spine creased in the small, considerate way of a person who had been reading aloud and had been interrupted. Hermione sat in the window seat with her knees drawn up and her stockinged feet tucked beneath her, and she watched her husband. She had been married for 3 months. She had not yet, in any reliable interior way, stopped being surprised by the word. Husband. It still arrived in her head with a small private astonishment, as though her own mind, which had been thoroughly trained over 23 years to expect a great many things from the world, had not been trained to expect this one. Draco was kneeling at the hearth. He had taken off his outer robe. He was in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his white cuffs rolled to the elbow, the bandage long since gone from his forearm, and the dark mark beneath it faded, not vanished. It would never vanish. The curse magic that had laid it down had been too thorough for that, but faded in the way of an old scar that no longer commanded the attention of the body around it. He was building a fire. He was building it badly. He had grown up in a house where fires were built by elves, and he had decided, sometime in the second week of their marriage, that this was an unacceptable gap in his education, and Hermione, who had grown up in a house where fires were lit, with great fanfare, perhaps twice a winter on Christmas Eve and her mother's birthday, had been deeply unhelpful in the project of closing it. The kindling was not catching. He swore under his breath, in French, which he did when he was concentrating, because his mother had taught him French, and had also taught him that pure-blood gentlemen did not swear in the language they conducted business in. "You could use your wand," Hermione observed. "That is not the point." "What is the point?" "The point, Granger, is that I should be able to build a fire in my own house with my own 2 hands, like a normal person, and if you do not stop interrupting me, I shall be obliged to bring in firewood for the rest of our natural lives, and you will be very tired of it." He had not stopped calling her Granger. He called her Hermione in the morning, and Granger in the afternoon, and Darling once, very quietly, at 3 in the morning in the dark, and she had decided, sometime around the 3rd month of their marriage, that the rotation was perfect, and that she did not require him to settle on any one of them. He coaxed a small flame at last out of the kindling. He sat back on his heels with the air of a man who had personally invented combustion. "There," he said, "now we are civilized. We were always civilized. Now we are civilized. Before, we were merely warm." She laughed. It was the easy, unguarded laugh that had taken her almost a year after the war to learn how to make, and which she had been making lately, with a regularity that still surprised her when she caught herself doing it. He stood up. He brushed the ash off his trousers with the small particular fastidiousness she had given up around the 8th week of their marriage on teasing him about. He crossed the parlour. He sat down on the window seat opposite her, and he picked up the book he had set face down on the cushion, and he turned it over and found his place. Where were we? The hair, she said, had begun to be tired. Ah, yes. He found the place. He cleared his throat. He read. He read in the low, slightly grave voice he used for fairy tales. A voice she had not known he possessed until the first night they had spent in this house, when she had asked him, half asleep with her cheek against his good shoulder, what Beadle the Bard had sounded like in his mother's mouth, and he had said, "I will read it to you tomorrow," and had then, the following evening, kept the promise. He had been keeping it ever since. They had finished Beadle. They had begun on the Black family fables, the hare and the hedgehog among them, and they had moved through a small collection of French stories his grandmother had given him, and he was, this afternoon, in the middle of a story about a thrush who had married a sparrow against the wishes of both their families, and had, eventually, persuaded them. Hermione listened with her cheek against the window pane. She watched, beyond the glass, the lavender moving in the small September wind. She watched the long slant of late afternoon light fall across the boards of the parlour floor. She watched her husband's mouth move around the shape of a French word, and she watched the place at his temple where his pale hair had begun, very faintly, to silver. At 23, she had laughed at him about it. He had pretended to be offended. She had kissed it. He had stopped pretending. And she thought, with the small, slow, attentive clarity that had been her one true and reliable instrument all her life. There you are. There it is. There is the life. She did not say it. She did not need to. He looked up from the book, perhaps having felt the attention, and he caught her watching him, and he did not, this time, look away from it. He smiled. It was the smile she had earned, the slow, private, uncomplicated smile that he had given to no one else in his life, that he gave her at unguarded hours, that he had begun to give her in the courtyard of Hogwarts on a spring afternoon 1.5 years ago, and that he had been giving her with increasing ease in every quiet hour they had spent together since. He set the book down on the seat between them. He reached across. He took her hand. He turned it palm up in his and laid his thumb across the line at the base of her wrist where her pulse beat, in the small particular way he had of touching her when he wanted to be sure of her. And he said, in the low, even voice he used for the things that mattered, "Hermione." "Yes, thank you." "For what?" He did not answer for a moment. He was looking down at her wrist, at the place where his thumb rested, at the small, steady beat of her under the skin. "For," he said at last, "the foyer, the corridor outside the locked door, the candle, the letter, the corridor with the smoke, the window seat, the lavender, all of it." "That was a long list, Malfoy. I have been keeping it." "Have you?" "Yes." She lifted his hand. She turned it over. She pressed her mouth against the inside of his wrist, in the same place he had kissed hers, in a hospital bed on the morning after the war. and she held it there for a moment, against the small, steady beat of him under the skin, and then she lowered it again to the cushion between them. "You're welcome," she said. He laughed. It was a small laugh. It was the laugh she had taught him over the course of a long autumn and a longer spring, with patience and stubbornness and the occasional well-placed insult. It was the laugh he gave only to her. Outside the window, somewhere in the lavender, a thrush sang. He picked up the book again. He found his place. He read on in the late afternoon light, in the window seat of a house that had once belonged to people who had wanted them dead and now belonged to them, and Hermione Granger. Hermione Malfoy now in the legal record, though she had kept her maiden name for her work and would always keep it, leaned her head against the cool pane of the glass and closed her eyes and listened. The fire crackled in the grate. The lavender moved in the wind. The thrush sang on. And somewhere, very far away, a war that had ended a long time ago stayed ended, and a boy who had been carried unconscious to a doorstep on a rainy August night stayed saved, and a girl who had laid her hand against his cold cheek and refused to take it away stayed exactly where she had always been. Beside him, on his left, in the rhythm they had built together, in the long, slow walk through a life that was, against every reasonable expectation, theirs. It was enough. It was, in the end, more than enough. It was everything.
Історія 10. Драко в Ордені Фенікса. And that is the end. I love writing stories like this, stories where two people are not supposed to meet, not supposed to talk, not supposed to fall in love. And then they do. Draco was lost. He was very young. He was very afraid. And Hermione, she did one small thing. She put her hand on his face. She did not look away. Sometimes that is all love is. Not big words, not big promises, just one person who stays, one person who listens, one person who sees you when you are at your worst and stays anyway. I hope this story made you feel something today. Maybe warm, maybe sad, maybe both. If you like it, please leave a like, write a comment, tell me would you like more stories like this one. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next story.